The World's End is the third film in Edgar Wright's Cornetto Trilogy, and arguably considered to be the least well regarded of the three amongst general audiences. I recently rewatched it for the first time since it came out, and there's actually a lot more to this movie than I initially thought, and I think it's certainly deserving of another chance. In my opinion, one of the reasons audiences were so turned off by The World's End is the fact that it's perhaps the least obviously comedic of the three films. Compared to its predecessors, Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, a lot of the humour is much more subtle and less warranting of laugh-out-loud moments, and the expectation that this film would be as overtly funny as the first two, coupled with the fact that the first two are considered to be some of the greatest comedy movies of all time, meant that for a lot of people, it sadly never lived up to the hype. As a result, when people talk about the Cornetto Trilogy, this is the film that usually gets dismissed. However, upon rewatching the film, with the knowledge that it wasn't the laugh-a-minute romp that the first two films were, there's actually a lot more to unpack here. And this is all not to say that the film isn't funny, because it really is. Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, as well as their supporting cast, deliver exceptionally hilarious performances, and the film features some of the best examples of Wright's famously comedic editing tricks. The humour is just much subtler and under the surface than the previous two films. I think part of this revolves around the two leads, played by Pegg and Frost. Pegg's character in particular, Gary King, is actually somewhat tragic. And yes, this element of the characterisation is played for laughs in the first act of the film, as the supporting characters pity him and the fact that he's not been able to adjust to the adult world. Yet, as the film goes on, this is explored in much more depth. If the first two films in the trilogy satirise the horror and police drama genres, this one seems to play primarily with the conventions of a traditional drama, that is, until the genre subversion halfway through the film. Indeed, the actors, despite delivering comedic lines with masterful timing, are also able to flex some of their more dramatic chops in this film. The characters in the first two films aren't as simplified as caricatures, but the dramatic core of those films stems more from the situation. A lot of the appeal of watching a film like Shaun of the Dead or Hot Fuzz is to see a somewhat more stripped back, British take on these massive Hollywood genres. The characters are almost tangential to the situation. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that the characters aren't important to those two films. In fact, I think they're fundamental. Shaun's apathy, or Nicholas Angel's hard-faced seriousness, and the chemistry between Pegg's characters and Frost's bumbling sidekicks are absolutely critical in setting the tone and drawing us into the worlds of these films. I would argue, however, that it is the worlds of these films themselves that are the primary draw to audiences, not the characters. Of course, characters like Shaun and Nicholas Angel go through arcs over the course of their respective films, as the protagonists in virtually every film ever produced do, but the core of their personalities are somewhat stagnant over the course of the films. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, there is a comfort in the familiarity of their characters. To me, it's certainly preferable to some comedies which include contrived character arcs and, by extension, underwhelming third acts. There are so many comedy films with really promising concepts and great first acts, which are only let down by manufactured drama and attempts to take themselves seriously by the midpoint of the film. Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead are the opposite, in that their third acts include perhaps the funniest moments in the films. Critically, these two films include an aforementioned dramatic twist leading into the third act, but where they differ from most other comedy movies is their ability to include jokes amidst that drama. Neil Archer suggests in his analysis of Hot Fuzz that the film is unconcerned with making a point or taking itself seriously, and in doing so actually reveals a lot more about the peculiarities of 21st century English life than an elaborately constructed metaphor ever could. This is why, I think, they've endured the test of time and are regarded as some of the best comedy films of all time. The absurdity of the situation is consistent throughout the whole film, and the momentum of the humour never lets up. Paradoxically then, The World's End takes a vastly different approach to the comedy of the situation to differing results. The genre subversion occurs halfway through the film, and so up to that point, the only story we have is entirely character-driven. If it were a sci-fi film from the offset, like Shaun was a zombie film or Hot Fuzz was a cop drama from the very inciting incident, then perhaps The World's End would have benefited from a similar treatment. However, the genre itself is treated as a reveal, which is totally unique. Watching this completely blind going in, as I did back in 2013, this was actually a pretty shocking twist. I don't recall seeing any of the trailers, so I don't know if this was revealed ahead of time, but the poster coupled with the title made me think that this film would actually be riffing on the disaster movie genre. So without an obvious genre from the beginning, as mentioned, the film takes the shape of a traditional drama, albeit with Wright and Pegg's comedic flourishes. What this means is that unlike the previous two films, The World's End was able to properly develop and explore a nuanced personality for the two main leads. Gary King, as mentioned, is a fairly tragic character, and the film is able to define and explore exactly how he came to be the way that he is. Nick Frost's character, Andy Knightley, is similarly well developed. In a further subversion, Frost plays the straight man in this film, and is seen as the voice of reason, while Pegg, despite playing the protagonist, assumes the bumbling buffoon role. This leads to a really interesting dynamic, especially as the characters' pasts and their fractured relationship are explored. King's inability to move on from the past is played for laughs, yes, but it also makes for an interesting character study in the film's more serious moments. And so, unlike the other two films, The World's End has fully introduced a nuanced group dynamic by the time the genre reversal happens. Therefore, structurally, this film makes for a really interesting case study. A more traditional film would have the reveal that the town was taken over by alien drones as the inciting incident, which then drives the rest of the film. Here, it doesn't happen until the end of the first act. The real meat of the story, so to speak, only accounts for the latter 2/3 of the film, meaning that the first act is entirely set up. This means that even for some of the supporting cast, we have a greater attachment to the characters by the time the reveal occurs, and are actively rooting for them to survive this ordeal. But unlike the other films in the Cornetto Trilogy, the situation isn't really the point of the film. Whether the characters make it out alive is really secondary to the emotional heart of the story. What we as the audience are really looking for is to see Gary and Andy reconcile and come to terms with their past differences. The alien invasion acts simply as a catalyst for this to happen. I do genuinely think that the fact that it subverted expectations in this way caused so many moviegoers to write this film off at the time of its release. Aside from the markedly stronger characters, this film is the culmination of Wright's previous work. The action is so kinetic, the film is gorgeously shot, and the editing is phenomenal and doesn't feel remotely gimmicky. The setting perfectly captures the quaint English town feel that was so prominent in Hot Fuzz. I love seeing more familiar places to me personally depicted on screen like this. There really is a lot to enjoy here, and I think it's worth giving another chance with the knowledge that it isn't as overtly funny as the other two. Would I say it's any better than Hot Fuzz or Shaun of the Dead? Probably not, to be fair. They're both very difficult films to top, and there's a reason so many critics list them as their favourite comedy films. But there's a lot more going on under the surface of The World's End compared to the other two, and I think it will lend itself really well to further repeat viewings in the future. What do you think about the Cornetto Trilogy? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially about The World's End. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more, and until next time, thanks.